Welcome to the clay overview for Ceramics 1. Clay, what is it? Clay is a decomposed granite-type rock. It's taken millions of years for the rain, sun, and ice to break it down and turn it into clay. Clay shapes are flat hexagonal particles. Clay works because there's water in between the particles, and that allows them to slide and hold their shape. The properties of clay are that it maintains its shape when worked, dried, and fired. It actually shrinks when it dries and shrinks more when it's fired. The clay that we use shrinks about 12 to 15%. So when it gets fired, it actually vitrifies, or it turns into a glass-like substance when it's fired to hot enough temperatures, and that means that it's basically impervious to water or waterproof. Now on to the stages of clay. You'll see this piece here, it's actually thrown on a wheel. This is what, or a great example of wet work is. It's clay that's wet and very workable. On the wheel, we actually add a lot more water to our clay. The second stage is something called leather hard. That is when the clay has lost a little bit of its moisture. It still holds its shape, but it's still workable. Here is a picture of someone trimming the bottom of their pot. That's when we usually do that, when it's in a leather hard state. The next stage is actually greenware. The clay is dry, it's no longer workable. In this stage, it actually holds its shape, but it can break really easily. It's usually gray in color. And because it's so brittle, I usually say, if it's gray, stay away. The next stage is called bisqueware. That's when the clay has been fired once. Usually it's a peach or white in color project. The final stage is glazeware. That's clay that's been fired twice and has a glaze on the outside. It is then a completed project. Moving on to something that we do a lot, it's called wedging. That's the process of kneading your clay with your hands to remove air bubbles to ensure that it has a uniform mass. This animated GIF is really giving us an idea of what wedging looks like. So there's types of clay. There's three main types: earthenware, stoneware, and porcelain. Our clay body is a stoneware body. We don't use earthenware at Blaine High School, but the advanced students do use porcelain. So clay is super lo-fi. So the way that we used to measure heat temperature in a kiln was with pyrometric cones. Those cones tell us what temperature the kiln is at. They're actually manufactured to melt at a specific temperature. We bisque fire to cone 0506. That's about 1825 degrees. We glaze fire to cone 5-6 and cone 10, and you can see what those degrees are there. My number one question from students is, can I fire this in my kitchen oven? And the answer is no, because your kitchen oven probably only gets to about 550 degrees. There are two types of firing in ceramics. One is an oxidation. That's when the kiln has a presence of oxygen, like an electric kiln pictured here. The other is reduction, where there's a reduced amount of oxygen in the atmosphere. That means you have to have an open flame and some sort of fuel source. So a lot of the times when we talk about ceramics projects, we actually refer to parts of your projects like we do the human body. So you'll see on this diagram that there are several things that you might recognize from that sort of diagram: neck, shoulder, body, foot. Most pots have a lip, which is the top edge. Most pots have a foot and a body. The rest, depending on what you're making, will be slightly different. Now we're going to talk a little bit about glazing, and we'll go further into this later on in the trimester in another whole presentation. First of all, what is glazing? It's a vitreous substance fused onto the surface of pottery to form an impervious or waterproof decorative coating. Glazing is really an art, even though you can get a PhD in glaze chemistry. Some common oxides added to glaze. Cobalt, that's blue to black in an oxidation firing. Copper creates greens in an oxidation firing. And iron, similar to iron oxide, creates yellows to browns in an oxidation firing. The basic methods of glazing are dipping, brushing or painting, pouring, squirting, and spraying. The three main components of glaze are silica, alumina, and flux. The main ingredient is silica. The alumina is used to give glaze stability and adhesion, and the flux is to lower its melting point. So we also want to talk about a few artists to know. There's three major ones that we want you to know due to the fact that most of the pottery that's made in and around Minnesota and the 5 surrounding states is based on these same three potters. I'm going to tell you their names. The first one is Soji Hamada, the second one is Bernard Leach, and the final and probably most important to us here in Minnesota, because he's from Minnesota, is Warren Mackenzie. So the first of those three artists is sort of the grandfather of this whole tree. His name is Soji Hamada. He was a Japanese potter alive from 1894 to 1978. He was kind of the father of what they like to call this folk movement in contemporary pottery. The Meingei movement was alive in the late 19th century and started because these artists wanted to show the art of the common person. Our second artist is Bernard Leach. Bernard is regarded as the father of British studio pottery. He was a student of Soji Hamada. Leach advocated for simple, very common forms, just like Soji did, so that tradition of the Meingei art of the common people came through in his artwork as well. He's British. He was born in 1887, died in 1979, so him and Soji are basically around the same age, although he was Soji's student. Finally, the most important artist that everyone in Minnesota should know about is Warren Mackenzie. Warren Mackenzie has been a pillar of the clay community here in Minnesota for many, many years. He lived in Stillwater, Minnesota. He taught at the University of Minnesota. He was a student of Bernard Leach's, and he really continued that everyday common people pot tradition along. He really did believe in the everyday pots and using pots and not using them as artist collection. Warren was born in 1924 and died December 31st, 2018. He was a North American craft potter and a Minnesota gem.